Chapter 3. Making Friends. It was just as well, as things turned out, that Peggy had resolved on an early start the following morning. Dimly through the gray dawn she became aware of an elfish, white-gowned figure perched on the foot of the bed. Her sleepy questionings as to its identity were dispelled by a sweet, high-pitched voice. "Now this is to the seashore, Peggy, and that's the water where you are. By. I'm going to dive and make a big splash." Before Peggy could protest, Dorothy had carried out her intention, descending on her shrinking relative like an avalanche. "Kick, Aunt Peggy, kick hard!" she shouted, disappointed at Peggy's failure to enter into the sport with the spirit due its dramatic possibilities. "That's what makes the waves!" But Peggy was beyond kicking. When she had succeeded in dislodging Dorothy from a commanding position on her chest, she indulged herself in several deep breaths before saying plaintively, "Oh, Dorothy, why did you wake so early? It isn't time to get up yet." "It's time to get up for a picnic day," insisted Dorothy, "and you've got to cook luncheon, Aunt Peggy. And can I wear my rubber boots and take my dolly and my blue celluloid comb?" Further sleep was out of the question. Making a virtue of necessity, Peggy jumped out of bed, reflecting that this early start would give the frosting on her cakes a chance to harden. Getting Dorothy dressed was a process requiring time and patience, for the child was so excited by the festivities in prospect that she could hardly stand still long enough to allow a button to be popped into its rightful buttonhole. Inventors interested in perpetual motion should have made a study of Dorothy. She interrupted the process of getting her fat little legs into their black stockings by so many fantastic capers that Peggy forgot the loss of her morning nap in helpless laughter, and the day began cheerfully after all. By breakfast time, the comfortable odor of sponge cake diffused through the house told that Peggy had made good use of her time. It penetrated Dick's bedroom, and that young man, under the mistaken impression that he was sniffing the fragrance of waffles, rose in haste and reached the breakfast table on time. An unusual feat for Dick, who dearly loved the last minutes in bed, and as a rule needed to be called 3 times before responding. Dorothy was too excited to eat. She had made a collection of cherished belongings to take with her to the park, and tact, as well as logic, was needed to convince her that the occasion did not call for a pink parasol or a toothbrush. A compromise was finally reached, by virtue of which Dorothy agreed to leave all her belongings at home, with the exception of her shut-eye doll, on the understanding that she was allowed to help in packing the lunch basket. This ordinary prosaic task proved quite exciting that morning, owing to Dorothy's propensity to smuggle in such articles from the sideboard as appealed to her as attractive and desirable. A little after 9 the girls began to arrive. Priscilla and Ruth came up the walk at almost the same minute, and they all settled themselves to wait for Amy. It was understood that they must always wait for Amy, though, singularly enough, Amy always had a brand new reason for her invariable delays. Either her shoestring broke at the last minute, or someone called her up on the telephone, or her hat pins had disappeared, or some other unforeseen event interfered with her innate propensity to promptness. Amy's friends listened with cheerful disrespect to her latest excuses, and Amy was the only one of them all who accepted them at their face value, and honestly believed herself the soul of punctuality. At 9:15, Amy appeared, puffing a little, to show how she had hurried, and explaining that the fudge had refused to harden. The other baskets were grouped upon the porch, and the girls sat in a row on the steps, discussing some of the interesting events which had taken place along the terrace during Peggy's absence. At Amy's approach, Peggy jumped briskly to her feet. "We're all ready now," she said. "Where's Dorothy disappeared to? Oh, Dorothy, we're going to start now." There was no answer. "Dorothy," Peggy called again. "Come quick, the picnic's going to begin." This assurance was effective. At the end of the hall appeared a mysterious figure which moved toward the door with hesitating and uncertain steps. A weird white drapery concealed its face, and fell in flowing folds to its shoulders. Amy was the first to perceive its appearance, and she let fall her basket and squealed. "What is it?" she cried wildly, as Peggy, at the other end of the porch, turned upon her a startled countenance. "Oh, what is it?" "What's what?" Peggy flew to answer her own question. At the sight which had alarmed Amy, she stood as if petrified, her lips apart and broken fragments of sentences escaping at intervals. Meanwhile, the slow-moving figure had reached the door. From beneath the mysterious drapery came the sound of a stifled wail. Peggy came to herself with a start. "Dorothy!" she cried. "What have you got over yourself?" She touched the drapery with shrinking fingers. It was sticky, clinging. The fragment she touched fell off at her feet. "I smell yeast," exclaimed Peggy, sniffing. "Yeast!" She looked about her wildly. "Girls, it's bread sponge!" "She'll smother!" exclaimed the practical Priscilla, and forthwith clawed an opening in the sticky mass, through which Dorothy's face looked out. It was a solemn face at that moment. A suspicious trembling of the lips told that the tears were not far away. I don't like Sally," faltered Dorothy. "She put something in a pan up high, and when I pulled, it covered me all up." "That's the end of the picnic, girls," Peggy spoke with forced calm. "The end as far as I'm concerned. Bread sponge all the way from here to the kitchen. Bread sponge in her hair and her eyebrows." "I don't care, Aunt Peggy," cried poor little Dorothy. "I'd just as soon go to the picnic all sticky." It was a melancholy ending for so many cheerful plans. The girls protested that the picnic without Peggy would only be an aggravation. They suggested putting it off till another day, but Peggy, usually distinguished for her sweet reasonableness, was not in a mood to make the best of things. "She'd only get into something else, girls," she insisted. "The glue pot or the molasses jug. Even if the fudge would be just as good tomorrow, you can't say as much for the sandwiches. Go along and enjoy yourselves." While three girls wended their disconsolate way toward the parked car, a still more dejected procession of two climbed the stairs to the Raymond bathroom. Mrs. Raymond, hearing the sound of Dorothy's stifled crying, came out to inquire the cause of the trouble, and uttered a horrified exclamation at the sight of her small granddaughter. Although divested of the greater part of the massive bread sponge, enough adhered to Dorothy's plump person to give her a most unique appearance. Mrs. Raymond patted the round, tear-stained cheek and cast a comprehending glance at Peggy's overcast face. "I wish you had gone with the girls, dear," she said. "I could have attended to this little mischief, and it's hardly fair that you should lose your fun." "Just as fair that you should spend your morning scrubbing Dorothy," Peggy returned. "You ought to know I wouldn't leave it for you." Then, with the honesty which was one of Peggy Raymond's charms, she added, "I suppose I might better have gone than stay at home and act like a martyr. Never mind, Mother. There'll be more picnics some day." The process of repairing damages was a slow and tedious one. At intervals, Dorothy wept copiously into the bathtub and uttered broken promises to the effect that next time she would stand in a corner and not move till the hour of starting arrived. "And I shan't like Sally never any more," sobbed Dorothy, who had a habit, not unknown among older girls, of holding other people responsible for her escapades. "'Cause she put that high up where it could fall all over me." The last traces of glutinous matter were at last removed from Peggy's charge. Arrayed in a cling gingham with a bath towel over her shoulders, Dorothy was set out on the porch, where the sun could dry her golden hair. Peggy gave her attention to repairing damages elsewhere, and when she returned after 20 minutes' absence, Dorothy's hair was curling all over her head in a flossy yellow snarl, while in her hand she held a typewritten sheet of paper. "What's that, Dorothy?" Peggy asked, feeling the curly head for signs of dampness. Dorothy reflected. "It's a letter, I think," she replied, obviously giving the explanation which seemed most plausible, but speaking doubtfully. "Let me see." Peggy took the sheet in her hand and began its perusal, her eyes opening wide and wider as she read. "Honor is at stake," replied the Earl, his hand seeking his sword. The Lady Vivian uttered a cry of anguish and sank fainting into the arms of her attendant.